Welcome to This Moment in Democracy. I'm Saladin Ambar. This episode was recorded on February 27th, 2023. The contributions of women through the years have often been overshadowed or underappreciated, but each year in March, Women's History Month is a time for reflection, appreciation, and celebration. Today, we're celebrating with the director of the Center for American Women in Politics at the Eagleton Institute, Debbie Walsh. Debbie, welcome to This Moment in Democracy. It's great to see you.
Dean, thanks for having me.
I thought we would begin by, if you don't mind, sharing a little bit about your own background and some of your career before you came to lead CAWP as director. Could you share a little bit with our audience about yourself?
I am a child of the West Village in New York City. Grew up in the 60s and 70s there, which kind of tells you that it was a political time, and grew up in a political family with a mother who was very much a participant in the early women's movement, the civil rights movement, the peace movement. And politics was something we absolutely talked about at the dinner table. And I always thought that I wanted to do something connected to women's rights. And one of my very early memories is being taken to a debate for my congressional district when I was a kid at my elementary school. And one of the two candidates was Bella Abzug. And Bella won, and it was her first time in office. And it was, I kind of grew up assuming that women could be in leadership. And it was a great start to a career. And I actually came to Rutgers for graduate school. I went to SUNY Binghamton as an undergraduate, went to Rutgers for graduate school at the Eagleton Institute. I was an Eagleton fellow. And when I left there, when I graduated from Eagleton, I went out to Iowa, which was an experience in and of itself. Having grown up in New York City, I didn't even know how to drive before I got out there. Had to learn quickly. And I worked for a woman who ran for Congress out there, a woman named Lynn Cutler, who was terrific. But we lost that election. And after we lost, I actually came back to Eagleton to work at the Center for American Women in Politics. It was the center that got me to Eagleton. I read about the center in the New York Times when I was an undergraduate, and that's how I found out about Eagleton, and stayed connected to the center while I was in school there. And the folks at the center brought me back, and I started working in our conferences for women state legislators, working on surveys and studies of women office holders, and eventually became the director of our program for women public officials. Then when Ruth Mandel, our mutual good friend, who was the founding director of the center, became the director of Eagleton, I became the acting director for a little while, then the associate director, and then in 2001, I became the director of the center.
That is quite a path, and I imagine when you stepped into the door to CAWP and at Eagleton, you probably didn't know much about the founding and history of the center. Could you share a little bit with our audience about that?
You know what's funny is when I first found out about the center, as I said, I was an undergraduate student, and I read an article in the New York Times, but the article wasn't in the A section, it was in the style section.
Oh my.
Which was indicative of the time that stories about women, whether it was about fashion or whether it was about politics, landed largely in the style section. And so what I knew about the center, I knew from that article. But the center has a wonderful history. It was launched conceived very originally by two women who were connected to Eagleton in various ways, who proposed to the men at Eagleton, the director of Eagleton and some of the other male faculty, that there should be this center. It was, in the early 70s, 1970, when I think this first was being percolated, the beginning of the women's political movement. And they managed to secure a small grant from the Ford Foundation, was the original funder. And there was a little notice about it in local papers around the state, including a paper in Princeton, where Ruth Mandel was living and saw this. She was a PhD in English, had moved to New Jersey from Pittsburgh with her then husband and young daughter. And she thought, well, maybe I'll go volunteer there. There's this new center. It sounds interesting. I'd like to get involved. And they were so intrigued by her and interested. And she ended up as one of the two founding directors of the Center for American Women in Politics, kind of a circuitous route. And at the time when the center was founded, the conventional wisdom in the political science department at Rutgers and probably around the country was, why would you even need a whole center on women in politics? There was no subject there to study. And what I love about that story is that we're sort of in the midst of celebrating our 50th anniversary, and 50 years later, gender and politics and the intersection of gender and race in politics is one of the most important stories in telling about what's happening on the scene in the world of American politics. So we've come a long way. Still a long way to go, but we've come a long way.
Well, absolutely. Again, an incredible institutional journey as well as a personal one for yourself. These last 5, 6, 7 years, I don't know quite how to bracket it, have been most interesting, if I could use that euphemism with respect to women in politics, given the candidacy and ultimately the presidency of Donald Trump and its aftermath. But certainly there were controversies and issues surrounding women in politics and the proper role, and I use that word proper in quotes, to sort of mark out this era that we're in, that is, I think, fairly unique. How has the nation's political trajectory over these past several years shaped the goals, the path of CAWP and its programming? Have you had to respond in any particular way, or is it more or less onward as previously engaged?
We have the luxury at the center of having that long view, right? Of being able to kind of look back and then also look forward. So we've been marking the trends for women's participation in politics over these 50 years and over these decades, and seeing early on a kind of a slow, steady, incremental growth that was frustrating. But at least it was kind of ever inching forward. And then kind of post 1992, which was, you remember, a year called the Year of the Woman. It was the aftermath of, we have had a number of years of the woman.
Yes.
That was one of them. And that was in the aftermath of the Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas hearings, a moment when I think Americans really saw what it meant for the underrepresentation of women and women's voices. And, people were riveted to those hearings and watching a Senate Judiciary Committee that was all male and all white. And this young Black woman, law professor, comes to testify and to tell her truth, and is basically ridiculed, kind of demonized, and not believed. And it was a kind of an awakening about where are the women, and where were the women on that committee who would have believed her, who could relate. And I think women across the country could relate to her story. And I think those men underestimated the power of that. And we saw in 1992, I mean, the hearing was not in 92, but the election in 92 was the aftermath of that hearing. And it was, at the time, the largest increase that we had ever seen for women serving in Congress. We almost doubled the number of women serving in the House as a result of that election. We saw women in the United States Senate and numbers that we hadn't seen, and in state legislatures. But then after that moment, we kind of stagnated, and it sort of sat kind of flat at the state legislative level Congress would go up very slowly, very incrementally, a little up, a little back, a little further. But after that moment, I think in 2016, when women around the country really saw the real possibility of a woman getting elected president, and they were denied. And they weren't just denied, they were denied by the election of somebody who, no matter who you supported in that election, on paper, the woman was clearly far more qualified for the role. So this whole notion that would you vote for a woman for president? Yes, if she were qualified. This woman was qualified, and still lost the election. It created a level of awareness, I think, for women around the country that they could not sit out elections, that they needed to be more engaged, not just as voters, but as activists and as candidates. And we saw record numbers of women running. We saw record numbers of women of color running. We saw record numbers of women of color getting elected, record numbers of women getting elected at the congressional level, at the state legislative level, all on the Democratic side. So we really saw that kind of enthusiasm. But I think, and it sustained itself in response to Donald Trump and to the kind of politics that we were seeing. But because that was all on the Democratic side, since then, we've seen Republican women coming kind of roaring back. Republican women lost ground in 2018, whereas Democratic women made tremendous gains. Republican women came back. They've made up that ground. They've increased their numbers. There's still far fewer Republican women serving in office than there are Democrats. But the kind of energy around politics for women has really escalated. And I think feeling like they have a stake in a way that they didn't feel before. And I think the Dobbs decision adds to that. And we'll be watching to see, the Dobbs decision came down too late to have an impact on candidacies in the last election cycle, in the midterms. But we'll be watching in state legislative races and congressional, particularly state legislative races, because so much now is going to hinge on the states, but also at the congressional level, to see if we see more women stepping up and running as a result of that. The demands on our work are higher than they've ever been as a result of the last 5 or 6 years. The interest in the work, our ability to play a really central role in helping to shape the narrative around women's participation in politics, to really talk about the fact that we want to make sure that we're not just talking about women, that we're talking about the diversity of women, that women are not monolithic. It's just sort of too easy to say the women's vote is this one thing. Women are ideologically diverse. They are racially and ethnically diverse. We need to be ever vigilant about making sure that when we talk about bringing more women into office and the importance of more women serving, that we're tuned into the questions of race and ethnicity in those conversations and in that work.
Well, I'm so glad you raised that, because one of my questions was, we hear a lot about intersectionality with respect to gender and race today. And I was going to ask you, and I think I might as well just have you tack on, if you don't mind, to that response. What does intersectionality mean to you?
I think for us, it means quite a bit of what I was just saying. It means that we have to make sure that when we ask questions about women's participation in politics, that we're not just looking at women as a monolithic group, that we are being keenly aware of differences based on race, based on ethnicity. The experiences of women differ, their routes to office, the challenges they face, the issues around fundraising, issues around the gatekeepers who are out there, and conventional wisdoms about who can run and who can't. I mean, one example of that is, one of the things that's really, I think, made it so difficult for when we think about how few Black women, Latinas, Asian women are serving, for instance, in the United States Senate.
Yes.
The assumption has always been that women of color can win in districts that are majority minority, and that's it. And so there is a presumption that they can't get elected. And if the presumption of the gatekeepers is you can't get elected, guess what? It gets really hard to raise money. It gets really hard to organize. And the cards are stacked against you. Well, we've seen, women of color are winning in majority white districts around the country more and more. We have an example of that right here in our state of New Jersey with Bonnie Watson Coleman. You think about Lauren Underwood in Illinois. There are many examples. And it's about kind of tapping into those questions and seeing it through that lens. So that you can understand how there's not sort of a one size fits all explanation for things, and certainly different challenges, different issues that arise, and we have to be aware of them, and we have to ask better questions when we do our research and look at this question of who's running, who's not running, why aren't they running, why aren't they getting the support, why are they having more trouble raising funds, those kinds of questions.
I appreciate that response. Yeah, it's easy for folks to be declarative and, pound their fist and say it'll never happen. And we've seen impossible things happen in politics. And so we should always be a little bit skeptical when people apply that to women in
That's
politics, right, to be sure. Being one of the nation's leading, I would say the leading resource on women in politics, CAWP is often cited in the news and in academic journals. Do you see CAWP as having a national responsibility to set the tone or to champion women running for office across the nation?
Yeah, I mean, and in many ways, we think about ourselves as the institution that has been able to help shape a national narrative around women in politics. I mean, journalists do turn to us, not just for the numbers, right, but for the analysis of those numbers and for a deeper understanding about what those numbers mean. We try to do deep dives to better understand women's routes to office and kind of explain those routes and how they're different than the men who serve alongside them. What difference does it make that they're there? And to kind of talk about this question of impact. And these are nuanced questions also about power and who has power, right? Just having numbers doesn't necessarily give you power, right? It's where are you situated in these institutions? What roles are you playing? There's no doubt that when Nancy Pelosi was speaker, she had power. And sometimes just having a large number of women might not give you the real power, right? Who's really at the helm matters. So I feel like we have been absolutely the only university-based institution that's been around in the ways that we have, who has the depth of knowledge, as I said before, the long view, but also the research background, the scholars who are at the center, who really can provide that kind of analysis and make it accessible to journalists and to the general public. And I think, this, Dean, this is one of the hallmarks of Eagleton, is having that theoretical knowledge, knowing the scholarship, but being able to translate that scholarship in a way that is useful to journalists, to the general public, and in our case, also to the activist community that's working so hard to bring more women into office. I mean, we do run programs, nonpartisan campaign training programs for women, our Ready to Run program, or our new leadership program, which is to demystify politics for college women. But we also want to make sure that all of the work that we do is getting into the hands of the activists who are doing the hard work of running PACs and local training programs and doing recruitment and strategizing on how to get more women into office nationally and in their own states.
And what are the most challenging barriers facing women who want to run for office today, or who have declared, yes, I am running? What are those barriers today? And perhaps are they any different than what they've been in the past? And if not, what's changed?
Yeah, Dean, I think that there are some of the challenges that you would sort of expect. I think still for women, we know about in fundraising that women raise comparable amounts of money to the men that they run against in comparable races. But we know that it may be harder for them. They're networked into worlds that don't have the same kind of resources. And the women who they're maybe trying to solicit money from don't have the same kind of disposable income that men do. So it might take a woman 10 phone calls to raise $1,000, where it might take a man 1 phone call. And I would say that those problems are compounded for women of color. So there's always that money question. I think in large part, one of the big problems are gatekeepers, the folks in politics who make decisions about who's considered viable and who's not, who's recruited, who's groomed to be a candidate. Most of those gatekeepers out there are still men. And whether it's malicious or not, they're picking folks that look like them. And so I think that's a problem. I do think that there's a new dynamic, though, that makes it harder, maybe not to run, but maybe to make the decision to run. And we may be seeing this for both men and women, but I think more so for women, is the tone and the tenor of politics has changed over the years. Certainly in the time I've been at the center, it's uglier, it's meaner. It has become more threatening. And women, we know from research, are more often the recipients of online harassment, physical harassment, or threats of physical harassment when they are in office, or even when they're running for office. And I think that gives many women pause. It's no longer, would it be fair to my family because I won't be around that much if I'm running? Now, would it be fair to my family because they might be physically harmed? I think the Paul Pelosi example most recently as the most visible. But, we had the Gretchen Whitmer, the whole threat of her being kidnapped and possibly murdered. This has become very, very real for people. And I think makes it harder when we think about trying to convince folks that they should step up and step forward. I also think these institutions that they want to serve in need to become a bit more family friendly. We used to say that, the women who were serving were older than their male counterparts. They usually waited until their kids were over 18 to run for office in the first place. And now we're seeing more and more younger women with children, women who can talk about the fact that they have children. It used to be you were told if you were a woman running for office, don't talk about your kids because everyone's going to ask who's taking care of your kids if you're running for office. Those times have changed, but the institutions being supportive of them have not. So issues and questions about childcare, being able to use campaign funds to cover the costs of childcare that you incur because you're running for office, all those things are changing now. And I think those questions come up for women in different ways than they come up for the men who are running.
Who do you like on the Republican side, potentially as a woman, now that Jill Biden, First Lady Biden, has sort of outed President Joe Biden as, in all likelihood, running for re-election? Is there anyone on the Republican side? I know we have Nikki Haley. Do you see any other potential candidates on the GOP side?
So I'm not endorsing, so it's not who I like, but who do I think is a potential? Well, I think
yes.
So first of all, Marianne Williamson has said she's going to run on the Democratic side. So It sounds like there'll be a woman on the Democratic side. I don't think a particularly strong candidate, but who's gonna declare it? It looks like shortly. Nikki Haley has already declared on the Republican side. I think there's a very good possibility that Kristi Noem, Governor Noem, will also declare. What's interesting to me about the two of them is that with Nikki Haley's entering the race, she is actually the first current or former woman governor to run for president. And that has been one of the challenges when it comes to women candidates for president, is that the pool of potential candidates is not nearly the size of the pool for men, because where we normally get our presidential candidates from are senators or governors. And there have been very few of either, but even fewer of governors. And governors are a particularly, I think, appealing group of candidates, as they have been chief executives, right? They've run something.
Right.
And so Nikki Haley is the first as a former governor, and Noem would be the second as a current governor. So I find that fascinating, and we'll be watching to see how they fare in a primary.
Well, I thank you for entertaining a very early, but maybe not too early question about the 2024
Yeah,
election.
I'm a little was hoping that we could put off 2024 for just a few more months, but it's Nikki Haley.
There you go.
So we're back in it.
she gave us a carte blanche to enter the House. Debbie, what are you most proud of in your career working at the center?
Wow. I have a lot of things I'm proud of. I'm really proud of the work that we did early on with women state legislators that I think in large part helped create a community of elected women officials, women who worked across the aisle and across state lines together around different policy issues like comparable worth, insurance coverage of mammograms, other women's health issues, issues around education and childcare. When no one was doing that work, no one was paying attention to the states, and we were doing it. I'm really proud of the networks of programs that we've developed across the country, both for our new leadership program, our college women's program, and our Ready to Run program, doing that work in the states, and creating incredible opportunities for women all across this country to think about the ways in which they might engage. I'm really proud of the people who work at the center and the team of people who really commit so much to this work, both the scholars and the professional staff who are, just work tirelessly to create an enormous amount of information and knowledge that is so useful to a whole area of study. And I guess I'm also really proud of the fact that the center has been at the hub of so much of what has happened in this field. And in large part, because of the center, an entire field of study was created. There wasn't a subject. We laugh at them for saying, what's the subject? But the reality was, before we came along, there was a subject to study, but there wasn't a subject of politics in the field. And now there is, and it's taken very seriously. And I think our work has been core to that happening. And so sort of all of those things make me really proud.
If someone wanted to find out how to follow CAWP and maybe learn more about these programs, perhaps to get involved with CAWP or to run for office, where should they find that information?
Well, our website is pretty easy. It's just CAWP.rutgers.edu. You can sign up for our newsletter, which comes out twice a week, that lets you know all of the newest information. But if you get onto our website, you can really explore. You can I mean, I can't even begin to tell you how much is there. We cover every election meticulously. We have all the most recent numbers for women who serve in office at every level, from the municipal level up. But we also have incredible historical data, including a database that goes back to the late 1800s with every woman who has ever served in elective office from the state legislature up. And when we know it, where possible, and in the most recent years, we also have the race and ethnicity of those women. So it's a searchable database. Take advantage of it. It's great. And you can learn about our various programs, the ones that folks can participate in, like our Ready to Run program or New Leadership. So I hope folks will go and visit the site and sign up for the newsletter.
Well, that's terrific. Thank you for sharing all of that. Listen, we both, as you alluded to earlier, have a mutual admiration, love, one might say, for the late, great Ruth Mandel, who led in so many ways. I just want you to know that you are clearly building a legacy of your own that's a powerful one that I think anyone who knows Ruth and her legacy at CAWP and at Eagleton will be very proud of as well. So thank you for all the work you do. And thank you for taking some time out of your busy schedule to be here with us today on This Moment in Democracy.
Thanks so much, Dean.
It's been a pleasure. Today's podcast has been brought to you by the Eagleton Institute of Politics. Eagleton is a nonpartisan research unit of Rutgers University, New Brunswick. This Moment in Democracy was made possible in part by the generosity of Gerald and Kiko Harvey and Eagleton's many supporters. To support Eagleton's work or sign up for its newsletter, click the links in the description. To learn more about the Institute, visit eagleton.rutgers.edu and follow Eagleton on social media. Thanks for joining us.